Welcome to the Afghan Eye YouTube channel. If this is your first visit, make sure to subscribe and press the notification bell so that you won't miss any of our new videos. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to episode 23 of the Afghan Eye podcast. I am Sangar
And I'm Ahmed-Waleed.
So yes, guys, if you're new here and if this is the first time you hear any of our episodes, if you have any suggestions, comments, please reach out to us. Our email address is info@afghaneye.org, and you can also connect to us via Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. The links will be available wherever you find our podcasts. So with that out of the way, our guest is Dr. William Ruger. Dr. Ruger is a tenured professor with more than 20 years of experience teaching foreign policy, international relations, counterterrorism, and security studies. He's a research fellow in foreign policy studies at the Cato Institute and vice president for research at policy at Charles Koch Institute. Dr. Ruger was former President Donald Trump's nominee for ambassador to Afghanistan, and he has recently published an opinion piece in the New York Times titled "Why President Biden Must Withdraw from Afghanistan." So, Dr. William Ruger, it is an honor to have you as our guest. Welcome to the Afghan Eye podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you guys.
Okay, so Dr. Ruger, so you've served in Afghanistan, you've campaigned for years for America to withdraw from Afghanistan, you've been opposed to the war and occupation of Afghanistan. As Sangar mentioned, you've been published in the New York Times calling on President Biden to withdraw from Afghanistan. So fundamentally, why would you say you're opposed to the war in Afghanistan, the occupation in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, I start from a realist perspective, right? I think of the United States foreign policy as being something that should be aimed, in a very laser-like way at America's safety and security, the conditions of our prosperity, and protecting our liberal democratic system here at home. And when I look at the conflict in Afghanistan that we've been fighting now for almost 2 decades, I no longer believe, or I believe that it no longer serves our purposes in those ways, right? I did believe that it was the right thing to do after 9/11 to go into Afghanistan and to do 3 things. One is to decimate Al-Qaeda in that country as a organization with the intent and capability to harm the United States. I think we needed to kill or capture Osama bin Laden, and we achieved that. And we needed to punish the Taliban for the support it had given to Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So I think that those 3 goals have been accomplished, and that's really what our interests were. And so we won the war that we needed to win because we accomplished those. But then we added all of these war aims on top of that. We expanded them to include things that simply aren't necessary for those vital interests that I just talked about. And therefore, the fact that we've lost that war in terms of meeting those goals, it doesn't really matter that much, in the sense that for our national interest, we don't need to be in Afghanistan any longer. And while, again, there are trade-offs in terms of some of the things that people care about, including values promotion, democratization, and so forth, those are not things that I think the United States is well equipped to do with its military in Afghanistan, nor does the cost-benefit analysis work out in our favor. So it's time for us to leave. And I think it's good policy, and it's also good politics for President Biden, just as it was good politics for President Trump, I believe.
Okay, so Dr. Ru, and you were also deployed in Afghanistan. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Is there sort of any experience in Afghanistan that perhaps aided you in reaching the conclusions that you've reached right now? When and where were you deployed?
Yeah, and look, my argument about Afghanistan, I think, stands on an intellectual framework, right? Again, it's rooted in realism and restraint. And so it doesn't depend on the fact that I am a veteran of the conflict there. That being said, having spent so much time in Afghanistan, it clearly impacted the way I think about the country, the society, the culture, and the region and America's role there. So I was there in 2008, 2009. I was mostly in Kabul, but I also was able to spend some time in Kandahar, Uruzgan, and Zabul. So and I definitely value the time that I was able to be down there, as well as in Kabul. I mean, Kabul is a fascinating city in its own right. But I think that I only wish that I got to see other parts of the country. We were talking before. I really hope for a day when I can go to Afghanistan again. And to go to Herat. And to go to Mazar-e Sharif and Bamiyan and other parts. I mean, the country is such a beautiful country in many ways that you can't help but go there and be saddened by the fact that the country has been torn by conflict for so long. When there seems to be so mumuch potential there, and I'm always impressed by how resilient Afghans are in the face of 40 plus years of conflict and the challenges that have been presented by its geography and it's being positioned near countries like Pakistan and all the way back to the 19th century when it was a victim of the Great Game between the British and the Russians, for example. So I think that again, like I said. My experience there, I think it has shaped me, but I hope to have further experiences in the country.
And which years were you there, Doctor?
I was there in 2008, 2009.
2008, 2009. Okay.
Yeah, and it was an interesting time period because that was when you had General McKiernan was the commander of ISAF, the coalition force in Afghanistan. And then General McChrystal came on board after that. You also had a change in the presidencies in the United States, going from George W. Bush to Barack Obama, and then you had the uplift of troops, and eventually a pretty large surge of troops on the American side, it was just a very interesting time to be there. Not to mention the financial crisis back home, and so. I mean, I just look back on that window, and it was very interesting to be there.
So, aside from sort of direct experience in Afghanistan, Sangar also mentioned earlier you're a scholar in international relations. As you said, you're an advocate for a reorientation in American foreign policy, and like you said, that's based sort of on a intellectual framework. And you alluded earlier to sort of values promotion. So. What would you say fundamentally were the mistakes made by American policymakers towards Afghanistan since 2001?
Yeah, the biggest mistake, and it was extremely deadly for America and Afghanistan, is that the United States expanded the war aims so broadly, and including things that just simply the American military and outsiders at scale are just not really appropriate to do, right? So, to try to remake Afghan society, one is the question whether this is something the United States ought to do, but two is the question of whether it could even be done. I mean, there's a hubris in trying to think that you can reshape a place that is so diverse and complicated. And it has so many factors, working against what we were trying to do there, that I think that it was a fool's errand, right? It really was foolhardy for the United States to try to attempt that, particularly relying on a kind of centralized model that our own country's history doesn't suggest was how we were designed, right? The United States was designed as a country that had significant appreciation for localism and the differences between the different parts of the United States at its founding, a recognition that our politics needed to take account of that. That's why we have a federalist system. And again, there were certainly downsides to that, and our country suffered from that in terms of not only the harm that occurred in terms of our history with slavery, but also fighting a civil war to resolve that. But the fact is that a decentralized system has lots of advantages, especially in a country that has so many differences. And I think in Afghanistan, trying to have a centralized state and trying to rely on the mayor of Kabul, as people put it, right? That became a real challenge, I think, and a mistake. But again, the biggest mistake was the expansion of the war aims. What the United States should have done is to stay really focused on what it needed to do, right? It was really decimating Al-Qaeda. It was, eventually, like we did do, but it took a long time, finding and killing or capturing bin Laden and the other people responsible for 9/11. And making sure that the Taliban understood that what they had done was unacceptable and to be punished appropriately. But then we should have left. And I can't give you the date. I can't say it was July 20th of 2000 and whatever, right? But the fact is that the United States at a certain point needed to say, look, we accomplished what we needed to. We're leaving on our terms. We were not chased out of this country, but we were leaving on our own accord. And let us tell you again that whatever happens here, if it is again used as a base of operations for attacks against the United States, we will continue to punish those responsible. And I think we also needed to maintain a counterterrorism capability offshore. We keep our eyes on what's happening in Afghanistan. So any terrorist group with the intent and capability to harm the United States, that the United States would use its forces. There was a good piece in the Wall Street Journal today by Gil Barndollar, a friend of mine, talking about the idea of using punitive expeditions. Those are the types of things that we could do to meet our interests. And again, I don't apologize for that. The United States has its interests. It needs to protect itself. All countries want to protect themselves against those who might do them harm. And so that could be required. But otherwise, we should leave Afghanistan to be the problems of Afghanistan to be resolved by Afghans. And that's been a big part of my message, is that the future of Afghanistan has to be decided by Afghans. And I think that outsiders can play productive roles in the sense of using diplomacy. I think that it would be wrong for us to take away financial assistance from Afghanistan at this point, but we should wean the country away from it so the economy can be sustainable, so that money isn't greasing the gears of corruption like it has been. But I do believe that NGOs, for example, can be helpful. Because one of the great things about NGOs, or diplomacy, or economic activity that's between peoples, right, in terms of, say, trade, international trade, particularly in that region, is that it's positive sum, right? It's consensual. It's on the terms of the people who want to engage. So if there is a vaccination campaign run by an NGO, or if there is if there are business-to-business relations, or there's simple humanitarian work, right? I remember there was a group there that was helping people with eye care, an NGO, right? That's the kind of thing that I think is productive of good relations between peoples, that doesn't involve coercion or conflict or war. And again, I'm not naive about the fact that power matters, right? I do believe that you do have to have governance in a country to protect property rights, to protect individual rights against those who would do each other harm. But that's not really the role of the United States government to provide that in a foreign country. For one thing, it stimulates pushback, because who likes to be ruled by someone far away? And I think there's always a perception when you have troops in a country that you're essentially ruling them from abroad. And I don't think that's helpful, and no one likes that. I certainly, don't. I mean, look, I'm from a small part of New Hampshire. It's also mountainous. Not as the mountains aren't as perhaps as tall as Afghanistan, but I don't think we like to be told what to do by Washington, and it's our country. So the idea that Washington should tell people in Helmand what to do is a little bit much.
You guys didn't like it with the British redcoats in the late 18th century either.
Now again, like I wouldn't draw that comparison too closely because I think that our war in Afghanistan was justified, and again, I feel it's terrible that innocent Afghans have been caught in the crossfire there. But the United States did need to punish the Taliban for its activities and to protect us against terrorist groups that were operating from there. So I don't apologize for that at all. That being said, yeah, you're right. I mean, people don't want to be ruled by those who are from distant countries who don't necessarily share their interests or their values.
I agree, and I think there are 2 points that I want to pick on that you've raised. First of all, was the values promotion that you alluded to, sort of the inherent hubris of trying to remake Afghanistan in sort of an American image. And I think one of the major pitfalls of that was that it was framed as sort of a liberal democratic experience, but staffed by people with a track record that was anything but liberal or democratic. So I think when it comes to values promotion, like you said, there's the feasibility of it at the outset, but also the actual steps that were implemented in sort of trying to achieve a certain thing. Those didn't work, and that's unfortunately one of the reasons why the project didn't work. But I sort of want to pick at something else. You said that it's not for essentially the United States to remake Afghanistan and make it a liberal democracy. But now there's a question that could be asked of you, and that is that as a leader of the free world in a time in which liberal democracy seems to be somewhat under threat to varying extents depending on your perspective, doesn't the US have a moral responsibility to promote freedom and liberty in Afghanistan, especially sort of, with the American sort of heritage of give me liberty or give me death, Patrick Henry, 1775? Does the US not have a moral responsibility? I mean, if we look at the former National Security Advisor of Donald Trump, H.R. McMaster, he in a recent tweet alluded to the conflict or characterized it as being one between civilization and barbarism. Do you not take the view that the US, this is about more than just cold strategizing, and there's something more to it? There's something inherently with value here.
Yeah, it's a great question, and HR and I just simply disagree, and we've had sharp disagreements in the past as well. But I fundamentally don't believe that there is a moral responsibility for the U.S. government to engage in the promotion or spread of our institutions or our values to other places. I would like to see them flourish, and I believe that it would be fantastic for a country like Afghanistan or any other country to adopt some of the values that our country has embodied over the last several hundred years. But I don't believe it's the U.S. government's responsibility. The U.S. government has a responsibility to protect the rights of its own people at home and to protect the United States from foreign aggression against it. The United States should promote its interests, and I mean that, like I said earlier, in terms of our safety, the conditions of our prosperity, and our liberal democratic system at home. There's no moral responsibility to change other countries in its image, unless that was necessary for our safety. And I think that's the rub. I don't believe it's necessary, right? Afghanistan doesn't have to look like Boston, Massachusetts. You talk about the Redcoats. It doesn't need to look like Boston, Massachusetts in order for the United States to be safe and prosperous. It just doesn't. And if it does, then what does that mean for a country like Saudi Arabia that is so hostile to our values in so many ways, and yet we consider it to be a partner in international relations? So I think that the foreign policy establishment wants to have it both ways, right? The United States won't be safe unless the world is like us, and yet at the same time, they're not interested in doing regime change in places like Saudi Arabia.
No, 100%. I do agree with that. But it's interesting that you said that because a lot of the opposition to, let's say, first it was President Trump's negotiations with the Taliban, and then it was the Doha Agreement, and now it's President Biden's announcement. A lot of the opposition to it, while there's been the moral aspect of it, of how could the United States abandon its allies, but there's also been, oh, well, the Taliban's ideology. There's been a op-ed published today in the New York Times about sort of, the women's rights and that sort of thing. And it sort of leads me to my next question. I'm not asking this question as a believer in sort of the angle from which it's being posited. I'm not a believer, but whilst you're here, what would you say to those, especially in Kabul, that, the United States may have its problems, there may be problems, I don't know, with crime, with institutional discrimination, that sort of thing, but that its democracy is not under existential threat, and that you as a privileged white male, and all of us here are male as well, I guess, but you as a privileged white male are advocating a course of action that puts Afghan democracy under existential threat, and puts the rights of women under how would you because the debate obviously is not purely one that's argued with cold hard facts. There's a lot of sort of emotion attached to it. So how would you go about addressing that? You're a privileged white male and you're putting Afghanistan's democracy under threat.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm putting it at threat at all. I mean, what am I doing? What is the United States doing to put it under threat if it ceases to be in a conflict in that country, right? I mean, there's no positive responsibility there in the sense of the United States has to be in Afghanistan. It has to be protecting women's rights. It has to be protecting the government there. We didn't go in to do that. The American people would have rejected soundly any thought. Like, imagine if on 9/10/2001, someone had proposed in the United States that we should go to war to advance the cause of women's rights in Helmand. That person would have been laughed out of the conversation. And so the fact is we just don't view international politics that way. I mean, there are some people do, but not. I don't think most countries do. The United States there are some people in the United States that talk a different language, I think, than the way foreign policy has traditionally been conducted. And so I just disagree with it. I do, however, again, just to be clear, because I think there's a nuance here. I would like to see liberal values, at least the good ones, the ones that I believe in. I would like to see those flourish in a place like Afghanistan. I think Afghanistan will be better off as a whole, as a country, and I think that individuals will be better off if they embrace it. But I don't think that the point of the bayonet is the best way to do that. And again, even leaving aside whether there is or isn't a moral responsibility, there's also just the question of, is it achievable? And we've been in Afghanistan for almost 20 years. And to be honest, like, what is the state of human rights in Afghanistan today? There are lots of areas in which Afghanistan falls short of where I think liberalism would have it be, even after all this time and energy, blood and treasure that's been spent. What is the status of the other, to use a postmodern term, since you entered into this whole postmodernism here? In a country like Afghanistan, I mean, again, you guys know it better than I do, and I want to have some humility because, again, I'm not Afghan myself. How do Afghans even conceive of the other? My understanding is that given the complexity of Afghan society, that to even talk about Afghans as opposed to talking about, Popalzai and Gilzai, to talk about Hazara versus, Tajiks versus, Pashtuns, right? Is that it probably depends on the context even when we think of who the other is. And I think that complexity of the relationships matter a lot when it comes to these questions that you're talking about. And that's why I think that we have to be careful, very careful, and have humility as outsiders. Kind of thinking about reshaping a place that has so many differences, and where you could really make it, mistakes even with the best of intentions. And I think in a lot of ways, the United States did have the best of intentions. Not just in terms of like what we were trying to achieve for ourselves because of our security needs, but the best of intentions in terms of some of the things the United States wanted to do. But look, there are people who disagree, right? And in a world of value pluralism, when people disagree, oftentimes there's going to be a clash. And I think we saw that. And ultimately, the United States has not been successful at promoting a lot of the things that we tried to. And I think that, we need to maintain that humility. That is actually a part of our value system, right? One of the things about the founding fathers of the United States is there was a deep sense about the humility, of humility about human nature, a humility about what institutions could accomplish and what they can't, a humility about America's role in the world. That wasn't just because we were a relatively weak country when we were founded, but also because of the things that we understood were dangerous to our own system of government and our country at home, of getting involved in foreign conflicts. And this is why someone like John Quincy Adams, who was a great American patriot, one of our most distinguished diplomats, a president of our country, the son of a president, John Quincy Adams talks about how we shouldn't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And he talked about how, that this could actually undermine our own system here at home. And I think that we ought to recognize that war is terribly destructive. I don't have to tell Afghans that. But it also has impacts in terms of these types of wars on the country that's pursuing it abroad. Whether that's called the boomerang effect or blowback, right? That happens. And you're seeing that we have huge debt and deficits problems in the United States that not only threatens our country, but threatens the global economy. And while it's not simply military spending that contributes to that, that is a part of it. And we also have other challenges. And so the United States needs to get its own house in order, I think. And I think we haven't even figured out how to solve some of those problems. So why try to figure out the, kind of really complicated challenges of even a village in Zabul, for example.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you. So if we look at the timeline. And I mentioned the timeline briefly when I was discussing sort of the quite hysteric reactions to these sorts of announcements as to U.S. shifts in policy. First, we had the Trump the Trump administration negotiating directly with the Taliban, which culminated at long last after 18 months in the Doha Agreement. That Doha Agreement was essentially postponed by 6 months because the government in Kabul didn't want to comply with the prisoner exchange as a matter of principle. And once intra-Afghan negotiations started, we got a new administration in Washington, D.C. There was a lot of vagueness. We didn't really know what was going to happen. There were influential groups like the Afghanistan Study Group that were actually advocating essentially scrapping the Doha Agreement. So now President Biden, thankfully, thank God, didn't take the advice of the Afghanistan Study Group on board, but he's announced that he'll withdraw troops on September the 11th, the totality of troops. But in doing so, he's actually broken the Doha Agreement and the May 1st deadline. So whilst, you've campaigned for years for a withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan, President Biden hasn't actually adhered to the text of the Doha Agreement that set this whole thing in motion. Why do you think President Biden did that?
Well, I think it was a mistake to do that. And I think a part of it is that the administration just wasn't clear what it wanted to do, whether it actually wanted to live up to the terms of the Doha Agreement. So it dithered. They would call it a review. But I think that the United States should have stuck to the May 1st deadline. I think that this review process, and I think, frankly, that there were domestic spoilers and foreign spoilers who simply did not want the United States to live up to this agreement with the Taliban and withdraw. And I think it was a mistake. We could have withdrawn responsibly in that fashion, and I think that would have supported the argument I would make again that we won the war we needed to fight, and we withdrew when we realized that the expanded war aims were not something we either needed to do or could do, and we left on our own terms after having a discussion with the Taliban and settling on the Doha Agreement. I think that expanding it or extending this ostensibly for logistical purposes is just not true, because we had from February 2020 to May 1st to get all of our troops out, and the troop levels had been down into the few thousands under President Trump, and we've had many months since the Biden administration came into power. Now, I say all that criticizing the administration for not sticking to the letter of the deal. However, I do believe that this was the right thing to do, and I praise President Biden for making the right decision ultimately on a speedy and full withdrawal of all U.S. military forces from the country. So I don't want to lose sight of the fact that he did the right thing from the perspective of what's best for the United States. And that's his job. I would hope that the Taliban would not attack Americans and coalition forces as we are leaving. I think that would be a mistake. I think that it's not necessary, and I hate to see unnecessary death or casualties. We're leaving. I think this is real. Now, I do worry about domestic and foreign spoilers. I don't think the government of Afghanistan wants the United States to leave. I don't think some of our allies in Europe want us to leave. I even think some of our adversaries in the region would like us to stay, not always for the reasons that are good for the United States, shall we say. But the fact is that, I think this is real, and I think we're leaving, and I think the Taliban should kind of appreciate that and not be a source of problems as we leave. And I think that's in our interests. This is in the Taliban's interest. It's where the Venn diagram, I think, overlaps. So I hope that they will not target any more American forces in particular, but the coalition as a whole as we exit the country. I would, of course, love to see a peace deal in Afghanistan. I would love to see an end to this long conflict where Afghans have suffered greatly. But I'm also a realist and understand that you can't quickly solve problems that have been the source of a devastating conflict for so long. You can't solve that quickly or easily, particularly given that I'm sure that the Taliban feels that they have operational momentum and the balance of power favors them in some ways. It may be that when the United States and others withdraw, it may be that the Taliban will push to the extent to which it can, and if it sees the balance of power resolving into some sort of equilibrium short of them returning to power in Kabul, that perhaps at that point you'll have the potential for a sustainable peace deal and an arrangement for Afghans to come together and find a path forward. But again, I want to caution Afghans about thinking that these things, once the United States leaves, that somehow that all the problems will go with us. And I don't think that Afghans are going to be. I think they understand that that's the case. I don't need to tell them that, right? But I do think that we saw under the Najibullah regime, right, that even when the Soviets left, the regime stayed in power for some time, and I would like to think I would really like for there to be a situation in which both the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan and all the different factions in Afghanistan came to an understanding that perhaps their interests could be furthered in a peaceful fashion as opposed to through further warfare. I'm also not naive and don't understand that frequently in international and in international politics during civil conflicts that it takes a long time for groups to realize when the battlefield is the battlefield options have gone to what the the famous German general Clausewitz talked about as the culminating point of victory, when doing anything more was actually going to harm their interests as opposed to help them. And my worry, if I'm the Afghan government or Afghans writ large that aren't affiliated with the Taliban, is that they have not, either they haven't reached what they believe to be the culminating point of victory, or objectively they haven't reached it from their perspective. So I think that it's going to be a very tough sledding, as we might say, ahead.
I'm glad you mentioned Clausewitz. So, keeping in mind Clausewitz's war is a continuation of politics by other means, the opposition to this announcement is obviously that, like you discussed, one of the possibilities is that the Taliban will see that they have momentum on their side and push on the military field in order to gain their political objectives, as Clausewitz obviously stated. But now there's a question I want to ask, in that during the Soviet occupation, you mentioned Najibullah as well. Najibullah's regime and the regimes before, the presidents before him, received massive quantities of heavy and quite advanced weaponry. So the communist regime had tank battalions, quite an advanced air force, Scud missiles, those sorts of things. The equipment was so abundant. I'm not a military expert myself, but equipment was so abundant on a technical level. The regime could launch an invasion of Iran or Pakistan. But we contrast that to now, and things are very different. We see that under this occupation and the current regime has only received sort of light ammunition, assault rifles, pickup trucks, a few helicopters, and probably hundreds of thousands of uniforms. So why did policymakers in Washington decide to equip Kabul so inadequately?
I think that's an interesting question, but I think it's the wrong question, if you will forgive me. I think the question is why did we try to build the Afghan security forces the way we did, as opposed to alternatives? I mean, my colleague Jason Dempsey, has talked about how we tried to build an Afghan military that was more like our own, as opposed to building something that might be more appropriate for the circumstances in Afghanistan.
Okay.
You should have him come on, I think, to talk about some of these issues. He's better suited than I am. But I do think that the United States certainly, I mean, we could run down all of the ways in which we made decisions, oftentimes tough decisions, in a way that was either more or less good, or in some cases the less bad option.
Okay.
And I think that a better way to think about it from my perspective is to say, why were we even playing this game in the first place? We did not need to engage in nation building for us to be successful, and that meant that the United States didn't need to be thinking about so much about heavy versus light, right? These types of systems or not. I think that the error was thinking that we needed to do these types of things writ large, and we built a pretty heavy infrastructure in the country that became so reliant on American power, particularly American air power. And I think that, again, I don't want to sound like I have all the answers, because governance is hard and decisions in warfare. I mean, particularly in Afghanistan, I mean, I'd be curious what you guys have to think, even though I'm not the interviewer, right? But I'd be curious what you guys have to think about some of the decisions, right? I mean, if you had relied on more decentralized military units, then you create different challenges, right? Around, quote unquote warlordism, right? If you try to centralize too much, is that incompatible with the basics, nature of Afghan society? So it's a series of trade-offs, and that's why, again, I go back to this, like, we needed to have better epistemological humility, greater epistemological humility. It's just really hard to know what the right levers to push are. And I don't know if people in Afghanistan are familiar with this, but at a certain point, the New York Times published this chart that ISAF had of all the different things, the arrows going everywhere, and different, kind of, I think it was even different colors on the of marker, and I think just looking at that, any sensible person would say this is just an impossible challenge for the United States military.
Yeah,
and I think it's a really hard challenge for Afghans. And so I wonder how you solve this. I mean, I wish that I would love to see the emergence of an Afghanistan James Madison, because if you know your American history or your political philosophy, that's almost what Afghanistan needs is someone who can understand an arrangement that is appropriate for human nature, appropriate for the society that you have, appropriate for the mores, the traditions, the culture of Afghanistan, because I believe that, and again, like even saying culture of Afghanistan is probably like in some ways wrong, right? Yeah. The cultures of Afghanistan. And again, I don't want to, be offensive, right? Like I think there is an Afghan identity, right? But there's also sub-identities, and these are both overlapping and in contrast in some ways. I mean, it just is a very complicated, what we might say in Boston, a kind of wicked challenge. And I just think that the United States needs to just allow people who understand this better, namely the Afghans themselves, to sort out the future of Afghanistan. Plus, they have a greater interest in it, right? American soldiers, they come, they spend, anywhere from, 4 months to, years. But, we're never going to be able to, I think, sustain a generational approach. We're just not suited for it. We're not the British with a colonial office, and we're like, I'm not going to bring my family to Kalat and live there and help govern Zabul. Not only do I not want to do that, I don't think it's appropriate for our country, and I ultimately think that I thought we were more advanced than to think that a kind of form of colonialism was appropriate for the 21st century and respectful for other peoples.
I'm really glad you sort of mentioned the whole thing about identities and centralization and decentralization. I'm not sure if you're aware, but the debate about centralization is a prominent feature of sort of the international discussion. And now there's this sense, not unjustifiably, there's the sense that the United States sort of transposed the very hyper-centralized government in Afghanistan. But see, the thing with decentralization is that what we have now is the same conglomerate that benefited very handsomely from centralization, now that they are far away from the levers of power, are calling for decentralization. So the whole debate itself in Afghanistan has sort of assumed quite an ugly sort of ethnocentric sort of character, because it's been dominated and initiated by those sorts of people. But I think you're totally right in terms of the trade-off of, if you have decentralized military forces, centralized, the arrows going all over the place as well. Because I'm reading a book right now by David Mansfield, and one of the problems there are also the trade-off between counterinsurgency and anti-drugs eradication as well. And there are examples, you mentioned Helmand earlier. That was a major problem that international forces had in Helmand, is that we can go for counterinsurgency and we can do it well, but then drugs, we just have to sort of forget about it. So yeah, I agree that there's the United States isn't going to set up a colonial office with its own records, and it's a really difficult thing to get into. But you mentioned Najibullah earlier, and you mentioned that he managed to survive for a couple of years following a Soviet withdrawal. So after this withdrawal by President Biden, which I'm sure we can all agree, we hope and we pray is concrete and will be carried out, will the United States totally disengage from Afghanistan in terms of, will cash and weaponry as well no longer flow to Kabul?
I don't think the United States will withdraw completely in terms of our overall engagement with Afghanistan. And I don't even think that would happen if there's some type of power sharing arrangement in which the Taliban come into government, or even if the Taliban came into power and tried to avoid becoming an international pariah. I still think there's a way in which the international community would try to provide some assistance, probably with a lot of strings attached in terms of certain outcomes that are probably connected to Western values. And the Taliban would probably have to have at least some modicum of appreciation for some of the concerns of donor countries. But I don't think that'll happen. I also think that there will be the interesting question is what will the outside military interference look like? If the United States, when the United States fully withdraws militarily, what will that mean in terms of some of the regional actors? From my time studying Afghanistan, I know the word Pakistan is always on the minds and lips of Afghans, and so one of the questions is, what's the future of Pakistan's role in Afghanistan? You can't mention Pakistan without talking about India. What role will India try to play? Then you think about Iran, you think about China, Russia, other countries, right? So it'll be very interesting to see what happens in terms of how other countries respond to this. And I think that this is a good result for the United States. Barry Post, a professor at MIT, had a piece in The Atlantic on just this question about outside actors. And you could even go as far as to be more Machiavellian and say, like, look, if the Chinese want to deal with some of the problems of Afghanistan, more power to them, because we've known what happens to the British, the Russians, and the West in terms of getting too interconnected to intra-Afghan politics. Given that the United States sees China as an adversary in many ways, one could only wish that it might have some of the same challenges those other three countries have faced.
Yeah, but the only thing that I would say, though, is that you mentioned earlier that you don't believe that the current government in Kabul wants to see a US withdrawal, and I concur with that 100%. But with regard to the extent to which disengagement happens, okay, so if the US continues to sort of support and sustain the regime militarily, financially, then there's also, it could also be argued that the current government has never really been enthusiastic about peace. And so if there's a sort of a stalemate on the battlefield, well, then the country's doomed, because the Taliban will not sort of compromise on their sort of ideals and sort of their values and what they want to see in a future government. Whereas the current government, certain people in the current government, very high-ranking figures, are very happy to let war go on as long as they see as long as the republic, as they see it, manages to survive in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I mean, look, we could go down a pretty dark alley here about kind of trying to work through the interests of particular countries and then disaggregating into the interests of particular leaders. And you always have to be wary. I mean, you can't be naive, right? There's a whole field of public choice economics and political science that looks at just this fact of, trying not to be naive about our assumptions about actors and their interests and how they relate in terms of their interactions. I think that war termination, again, it's incredibly difficult, not just war termination from the perspective of like the United States, where it's hard to get out of a conflict that frankly isn't that vital to the future of America and so it's a little bit easier in some ways than kind of ending. Let's say, imagine if like the situation in 1914 to 1918 in Europe, right, where you have great powers struggling and oftentimes not getting very far on the battlefield. How do you end those wars without achieving the kind of the ultimate victory type approaches like you saw in World War II, right? So how do you have a situation where the parties in the country can get to, one way, of course, is that one side wins and defeats the insurgents in the way that, for example, Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka did against the Tamils, right? That's one way you can end. But I think more often, it ends through a political process. And then the question is when do people feel like a political process is better than the use of the sword? And oftentimes that is when some type of equilibrium is accomplished on the battlefield. And it just takes a long time for actors to kind of get transparency, if you will, about what the balance of power is. Again, like not to be too wonky, right? But if you're going to think about kind of rational choice, right? Like why would anybody fight a war that they know that is not in their interests? Well, it's because it's not always clear, and it's not always clear. The battlefield is foggy, and so the real question will be how will the Afghan government be able to operate on the battlefield? Will it see people defecting from military service? Will it see, or will it be able to sustain the fight with the assistance of others in a way that will lead to some type of equilibrium where there will be, at that point, a war exhaustion or kind of rational choice on the side of the different actors to try to find a way in which, at that point, they can find peace. Again, unfortunately, there's not going to be a case where anybody's going to be able to wave a magic wand, either outsiders or insiders, because of those clear interests that you just talked about. And I think it's just important not to be naive about that very fact. And I don't mean just the interests of the polity or of the people, because we know that political actors aren't just calculating their interests based upon their country's interests, but also in terms of their kind of personal political interests as well.
Dr. Ruger, you just mentioned political actors. If we look at Afghanistan at the current stage, we have different political actors in Afghanistan. But if we turn this around and we observe United States, the United States is often seen as a unitary actor in global politics, often by laymen. But in the last 2 years, we have seen, on the one hand, the Trump administration pursuing a certain political strategy in Afghanistan. And on the other hand, we see conflicting statements by the military leadership. And we have seen various reports being published in the New York Times by leaks, anonymous sources from the intelligence community. So if we observe all of this in the last 2 years, we can say that the United States has different political actors with competing interests with regards to Afghanistan. Now, if we say that the Biden administration is now very firm and decisive and decides to pull out all troops out of Afghanistan, what guarantee do we have that other actors within the United States won't make sure that, the war lasts longer, or that the United States is dragged back into Afghanistan? Do we have any guarantees?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about this danger before of domestic spoilers, right? Of actors that aren't in favor of withdrawal and don't accept that the United States has moved on. That's why I think it's really important that the Taliban not give any, kind of give these actors, these spoilers, any excuses for that could be compelling to the administration to backslide. Now, again, I think that President Biden's discussion in the announcement and subsequent, I think is very clear. I think he's boxed himself in politically, and that's why I think this feels real. Also, because I think there's a transpartisan coalition here, and I don't know if people in Afghanistan have saw this, but President Trump even acknowledged that this was the right decision. Now you could say, well, of course he did because he was in favor of it before, but that's still important, right? It's important that Trump supporters saw that Biden supporters saw what the president said, that you have figures in both parties. You have I think what you have is you've seen, you saw Senator Cruz, you saw Representative Buck, Representative Meyer, you saw Representative Khanna, Senator Sanders, Senator Warren, right? You see a range of people across the two major parties in the United States supporting the conflict, supporting the end to the conflict. And then you also have outside groups. I mean, so for example, the Stand Together community that I work within, has a partner, Concerned Veterans for America, that has done a lot of advocacy over the last couple of years, and in particular is talking now about how praising the administration for its decision and trying to promote regular Americans, especially veterans, to express themselves and to say, yeah, this is the right move. So I do think that again, I don't want to be naive that there's no danger here, but I think that the United States is going to do this absent an exogenous shock. And I think that the United States should be very wary of turning aside if it's apparent that there are spoilers trying to do that to spoil this, result.
Okay, so you mentioned the bipartisan sort of consensus on the need to end what is now America's longest ever war, right? Now, in light of President Biden's decision to withdraw troops, because there were a lot of people or a lot of quarters that you've discussed that were anticipating that he would abandon the Doha Agreement, but in light of that, there are claims that sort of the US is turning away from internationalism towards isolationism, especially the Republican Party. How would you address those claims?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's no such thing as isolationism. Okay. Isolationism is a pejorative that is simply used to try to denigrate those who want to do less than you do with America's military in the world. And and again, I'm not scolding you. I just hate this term in American politics, and there's no such thing as it, right? I mean, you think about me. I mean, I've been an advocate of realism and restraint for years and years. I think that the United States should get out of the war in Afghanistan. I think the United States should withdraw our troops from Syria and Iraq. I think the United States should close the door to NATO enlargement, any further NATO enlargement. I think the United States should pursue a responsible approach to the rise of China that's both neither Cold War II nor naive about it, and that defends our interests in Asia. But by no means do I want to isolate America from the world. I think that there's all kinds of ways in which Americans can be effective. One is through business-to-business relations, business-to-people relations, right? Trade. I think the United States should have a robust diplomatic capability. I think the United States should actually fight and win wars when they're required for our interests. And I think the United States should have a really robust naval, air, and space capability in order to protect our freedom of lawful navigation and our access to the global commons. So there's nothing isolationist about it. And I'm someone who's traveled quite broadly in my career and have valued getting to know other peoples and cultures. That's the opposite of an isolationist perspective. And I would actually argue that it's probably too cute by half, but I would say I'm the true internationalist in that sense, right? I want to provide positive sum engagements with people like the Afghans. I want to go to Herat someday and just kind of really enjoy the culture there, and hopefully spend a lot of dollars in the market there.
The true cosmopolitan.
Well, yeah, but I don't want to say that either, because I also believe, and that's why I would say kind of internationalist, but also nationalist, in the sense that I do believe that the United States' job is first, second, and third to defend America's interests in relation to others, and that we don't have the kind of moral responsibilities to do certain things, other than some of our basic agreements around, say the Geneva Conventions and whatnot, right? Those are responsibilities we should take, but largely because they're in our interest to do so. So at the same time, I think that I have a very strong sense that American foreign policy should be for Americans. I also believe that there's all kinds of ways in which individuals and other subnational units can participate in the world in a productive way. And even our state can engage in things that are state to state, that are positive sum. So, for example, arms control, right? Arms control is an important way in which the United States can work with others to accomplish joint goals, like the United States did during the Cold War with the Soviet Union and should continue to do. I'm also on the Fulbright board at the State Department, and I was very, very honored to be appointed by President Trump to that board. And that's a way in which you could promote, I think, positive sum interactions between peoples and countries. So again, I think that it's a red herring, if you will, to talk about isolationism. But I'll get to the, I think what you mean by the question, which is the United States trying to approach the world in a different fashion? And I think the answer is it's not. That has not yet been decided. There is a pretty robust debate happening in the United States now between advocates of the status quo approach to the world that has not been successful for America's interests over the last 20 to 30 years, that has got us embroiled in conflicts like nation building in Afghanistan, like the conflict in Iraq, which was an absolute debacle, and for your soccer watching audience, an absolute own goal for the United States. We've got, there's folks that want to continue with that status quo. And then there are the forces of realism and restraint. What used to be a smaller kind of insurgency within American foreign policy, which is now, I think, a much more robust community of individuals and institutions that are aiming at shifting America's strategic culture to one that has a realist understanding about the world and America's interests and the threat environment and America's role in it, and restraint in terms of how the American government uses its military power abroad, consistent with what I talked about earlier, right? About being clear about our interests, and then also understanding that means we don't need to be in Syria. We don't need to be in Iraq any longer. Heck, they don't even want us there. Afghanistan, we can militarily withdraw. About closing the door to new entrants to NATO, because the idea of having Ukraine or Georgia in NATO is an absolute mistake. That really, I mean, again, it's a small probability, but risk is probability times cost, right? And small probability, but the cost of a conflict with Russia that could spiral into a nuclear clash, that's a pretty severe challenge, and we ought not to willy-nilly expand our commitments, particularly because I hate to be so frank, but a country like Georgia, it simply does not matter to the United States.
Yeah.
I want individual Georgians and Georgian society to be robust and healthy and flourish, but it's simply not strategically important to the United States, and that's just life.
Yeah, it was President Biden said something similar to Hamid Karzai, where something similar whereby Hamid Karzai was basically asking for like a top tier ally position, rather embarrassingly, in my opinion. And President Biden sort of said to him that Pakistan is sort of 50 times more important to the US than Afghanistan. And, it's tough cookies, as they'd say in America, but that's, different states have their priorities. And so, with regard to tiers and levels of relationships, bilateral relationships, partnerships, the US Afghan relationship since 2001 is described as a strategic partnership. Okay. Now, assuming that we all agree that strategic partnership is the best way to describe that, according to, let's say, the text of the Doha Agreement, which has been delayed, but if we assume that that's sort of still modus operandi, okay, the future Afghan government or interim government will largely, or if not majoritarily, be staffed by the Taliban. What will the US Afghan strategic partnership look like with the Taliban in Kabul?
I think it's hard to say. I mean, if you looked at it, I think from in a vacuum, not with the kind of history that we've had, I think you would say that the United States' interests, both economic and strategic, are relatively limited. And if you have limited economic and strategic interests, then you can guess that the racking and stacking of where a country fits in terms of another country's partnerships, it's going to rank relatively modestly. That being said, again, the United States has been involved in Afghanistan for so long that one can imagine that the relationship would, as we might say, punch above, using a boxing analogy, kind of punch above its weight. The question will be what happens over time, because the delta between where it might be and where it, kind of looking at more objective features probably ought to be, over time, those things tend to close, right? And I think that means that Afghanistan is going to have to, I think it should be developing its relationships with countries in its region. Those are the countries that are going to have the most interests in Afghanistan, and to which Afghanistan is going to have greater interests, right? Whether that's it's all obviously complicated and challenging relationship with its country to its east, or it's also potentially complicated and challenging relationship with the country to its west. And that even leaves aside all the issues that you might imagine with countries to its north.
So we had an op-ed written for the Afghan Eye that was published recently, and it was essentially emphasizing the importance of Afghanistan's natural resources, especially in the coming decades, so including minerals like copper and lithium. And so Afghanistan's natural resources are a crucial factor, especially when we factor in sort of the shifts in the balance of power in Central and South Asia. You mentioned China earlier as well. Now, obviously, taking aside the moral responsibility and talking straight dollars, how would the US, after a complete withdrawal, ensure that it gets access to natural resources like copper, like lithium, amongst others, instead of allowing rival powers to do the same at the US's expense?
Yeah, I think that's the wrong economic lens to use.
Okay.
Right? I mean, that's a mercantilist lens.
Yes.
Right? So I guess I would ask the question is,
let's say US companies.
Right, but let me ask this question. How is the UK going to have access to the wonders of Afghanistan since it pulled its troops out long ago? Okay. The answer is not that you need to have the troops to get the resources. The market has incentives for those resources getting to market and getting to global markets efficiently. The United States doesn't need to have troops on the ground in Afghanistan in order to achieve our goals as far as natural resources. And the other thing is, let me ask you this. Japan has hardly any natural resources, And yet there are countries in the world who have far more natural resources, right? Like think about Central Africa. Which region of the world has been more important to the great powers, Central Africa or Japan? Clearly Japan, right? So I think the argument about natural resources, I think, is a flawed one, particularly given that there's an incentives of buyers and sellers to come together around that. And that the most important players in international politics have traditionally been the great powers, particularly countries that have strong economies that are built on high productivity industries and high human capital, not on countries that have natural resources as their main say export. Obviously the issue of oil is more complicated, right? But unless Afghanistan, becomes Saudi Arabia anytime soon, I think that its economic importance to the global economy is going to be fairly limited. And that even if it became more important, that doesn't necessarily mean that it requires the extension of American power, or that Afghanistan requires that for it to be integrated into the global economy.
No, but sort of how would the US, sort of moving away from the military aspect of it, would there be any sort of, according to the status quo, sort of bilateral financial or economic treaties or agreements, would there be any sort of course of action that the US would pursue that would allow US companies or individuals to invest more freely?
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, no, look, I mean, again, this goes back to our discussion about internationalism, right? Mm-hmm. I think the United States should reduce its trade barriers unilaterally when it comes to Afghanistan. Now, that doesn't mean that that's going to solve, a lot of economic challenges that Afghanistan faces, but on the margins, it's helpful. I mean, we're not a huge trading partner of Afghanistan, but it would be helpful, I'm sure, if people with a comparative advantage in the work that they do in Afghanistan could sell to the United States, with very minimal barriers to doing so, other than obviously the kind of transportation barriers that are always a challenge for Afghanistan as a landlocked country. I think that it would be in Afghanistan's benefit to reduce the barriers to outside investment and outside travel and so forth, right? Now, again, that's because I'm a liberal when it comes to my understanding of economics and the role of government. I think that if Afghanistan, I mean, like Adam Smith talked about this, right? The key to opulence is peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. And I think that the first and the third of those are things that Afghanistan is really challenged by. Not only the problem of the conflict, but also the issue of justice. I mean, my sense is that part of the reason why there are some people attracted to what the Taliban has to offer is because they don't believe that the Afghan government is providing a tolerable administration of justice. They're not providing justice. It's cronyist. It's biased towards the well-connected, to the wealthy, and again, it's simply not meeting the needs that Smith talked about. When it comes to taxation, I don't think that's. I mean, that's probably not Afghanistan's problems compared to other countries that have high tax levels. Heck, New York State has terrible taxes, and it's reducing its ability to be what it could be. And Afghanistan taxation levels aren't even close to that, from what I understand. But it's really the first and the third of those that'll be important. And I think again, reducing barriers to outsiders participating in the Afghan economy would be valuable. Getting away from a mercantilist, protectionist mindset is valuable. I remember I was in Nepal one time, and I was talking to these leaders there, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was something like when I talked about the importance of allowing others to participate in the Nepali economy, there was almost a sense of like, well, then they'll steal what we have. Like, and they didn't mean like literally stealing, but that somehow the market was a way in which other people could get the wealth of Nepalese folks. And that's a kind of old mercantilist protectionist mindset. as opposed to understanding how positive some interactions could occur between peoples in a way that would be productive, right? So if other countries got to use the kind of benefited from the things that Nepali people had a comparative advantage in, then they could trade for the things that other people have a comparative advantage in, or simply for their dollars, right?
Okay.
Dr. Ruger, that's a very interesting point that you brought up in Nepal, but let's just say further to the east in China, they have an entirely different perspective on economy, trade, etc. What we see right now happening all across the world is that China is expanding its influence by making sure that it has access to all kind of resources like in Africa, but it's also potentially going to do that in Afghanistan. I mean, they already have an agreement to exploit copper in Logar at Mes Aynak. So I
guess what I would say is that I would use just a different term, right? I don't think they're exploiting copper there. They're helping provide some of the resources necessary for those resources to come to market. And again, I'm not naive about what the Chinese are up to here, but it's also the fact that the more copper that gets to the international market, the better off I am, the better off you are, and the better off the Chinese are.
Well, I would disagree, sir, because
what are you going to do with that copper if people don't outside of Afghanistan buy it?
The problem is that let's just say I am all in favor of free trade. Okay, just off the bat. The problem is that Afghanistan is a very underdeveloped country, and we don't have a strong state that can protect the rights of citizens, that can protect property and provide justice. So what happens is that resources of Afghanistan can be very easily extracted without the money, the trickle-down economic system, that without the money actually benefiting the people in Afghanistan. That's a real threat. That's a real concern that people in Afghanistan have.
What I thought you were going to say, and here I would agree with you, is that the property rights, let's say, and again, like property rights in Afghanistan are incredibly complicated and underprotected, right? But to the extent to which they exist, I thought you were going to say that the strong would do what they will and the weak would suffer what they must, even if they had a claim to justice. And that I would worry about. And that's why I think it's important for Afghanistan in some fashion to have its James Madison moment, right? To provide for an effective state that can protect property rights. That being said, when you talk about, I mean, I don't like the term trickle-down economics. I think it says too much or says too little. But I would say that if Afghans benefit economically from resources being bought and sold in the international market, then there will be impacts on the economy in other ways. I mean, this is the old saying, like, you don't produce to put money in the bank. You produce to consume, right? And eventually, labor is going to result in someone consuming something. And so, if let's just say everything's on the up and up, right? It meets Adam Smith's definition here, right? You got peace, easy taxes, tolerable administration of justice, someone who owns justly the property rights. We go back to Nozick. I know we've talked about that before. There's just acquisition of the property and a just selling of the property or of the fruits of the property. And some people in Afghanistan make a lot of money. I mean, aren't they going to want to consume a bigger house or a nicer house or better plumbing or better, more rugs or, trips abroad using the domestic airlines flying into Afghanistan, right? I mean, there's going to be economic activity produced from this, and that is going to benefit a wider set of people. I mean, so I do think, I think this is why markets are positive sum, right? There will be benefits across the board, and there will be positive externalities, because at a certain point, right, the wealthy person who has been able to capture some of the production value of those resources is going to want a sidewalk in front of his house, and is going to want a road doesn't have potholes in it, and eventually there's going to be a demand for those things, and so I do think that, again, like, we've seen this in place after place, I would prefer to meet the requirements of a healthy liberal market order, which includes peace and a tolerable administration of justice. So I'm not like, I don't want to discount the what I think you're talking about is essentially the theft, corruption, cronyism, and exploitation of people's rights. And there I would agree with you that is a challenge for any country, including the United States. I mean, we had a famous case, there's a movie, you can watch it, called Little Pink House, in which something like this happened in Connecticut. So this is a problem for people all over the world, and I think probably even more salient in a country that doesn't have peace or a tolerable administration of justice. So I guess what I would say is, like, I sympathize, and I think that this is why, again, it'd be great to have a James Madison moment.
Okay, so this conversation is really interesting, and it sort of went towards sort of a utilitarian kind of slant. But there is one.
See, you said isolationist. Now you're really insulting me by calling me a utilitarian, because I'm definitely not.
I really do appreciate it. I'm going to ask one question, strictly speaking, to free trade, before we go back to sort of the politics of the matter.
And are you sure your audience is going to want to listen to me this long?
No.
Yes,
definitely they would. But
our audience, they like this kind of conversation. Trust me.
All right. I got about 15 minutes more, so let's go for it.
Okay,
let's go for it. Okay, but is there not a danger with free trade that when Afghanistan lowers its trade barriers, one of the problems that international companies that don't want to engage in business in Afghanistan is the conflict aspect. With conflict removed, is there not a danger that, for example, the rugs of Herat or the pottery, the crafts, in poorer countries, those industries can be totally decimated with free trade? Because if, let's say, an American company or a Chinese company or a British company comes in synthetically producing those rugs or that pottery, that those industries themselves could die?
But isn't the bigger problem that is the mass production of these things in China and Pakistan, not the mass production in Kandahar? I mean, like, if a mass producer of rugs came to Kandahar, and then maybe there is one already, then that's not you can't solve that internationally, right? If the competitors of the great weavers are going to be or rug makers are going to be international. And so I mean, again, I think that's why the carpet industry just needs to make a good case for why they should value handmade carpets as opposed to. And look, we talked about this for the audience. We talked about this before we came on air. I absolutely love Afghan carpets, and whether it's like the darker ones that are Baluch to the Tekka ghouls that have kind of come down from Bukhara, right? I think it's a fantastic industry, and I myself highly, highly value the ones that are handmade. And I would much rather pay more for that. And I think in international markets there will be people like that, right? Like, you could anybody could buy a picture of a Da Vinci, right? Like a reproduction. But look how much money that reproduction went. Was it the Saudi prince that bought it? Not the reproduction, the actual original. Yeah. So I think there'll always be a market for handmade goods. And I hate to mention it again, because Nozick even talks about this. You can find it in Nozick, right? Is there something about the authenticity that matters?
Yeah.
Which is not to say that, look, a lot of people will buy, won't care as much. But I think that the horse is out of the barn already on that, because there's a company here in the United States that there was recently an article in the New York Times about, it was like the rug. It was like the Moroccan or Persian style, I can't remember what it was, but it was like a gazillion people were buying this rug. And it's clearly not handmade. It's still beautiful. But I tell you what, it's not nearly as beautiful as again, I'm sorry to geek out on this, but I bought this rug in Afghanistan that I treasure so much. And again, I could have been fooled, but it looks like the kind of thing that is probably, one of a kind. It looks like it depicts a woman's life, her family's life, kind of around the carpet. And it's got brilliant colors and just very, kind of tight knots on the back, and very, just very, very lovely. And it just looks like it tells an individual story, depiction of their home, of family. And it's nothing like a Persian rug, but I would prefer this rug that didn't cost me very much to a $50,000 Persian rug any day of the week.
Yeah.
Because I value that, and I value the authenticity, or at least what I believe is. And I have no reason to discount it, because it was an older rug, or at least it was a rug that had some wear. But I think that there's a market for that.
Yeah.
And I think if we could reduce some of those barriers, and also it would be great. I mean, I don't know. Again, I'm not an expert in the carpet market, but what I would say is, whether it's carpets or pomegranates or anything else that could be a product that Afghanistan can sell, lowering barriers is good for everyone, generally speaking.
Yeah, both countries have their challenges, the US and Afghanistan, but I think looking forward to US-Afghan relations, a mutually beneficial relationship, sort of, where instead of aid being dumped into Afghanistan, whose benefits are not really well distributed, there could actually be some sort of investment or commerce that both sides could actually benefit from. As well as the fact that sort of Afghanistan, the aid industry, which is an industry in and of itself, which isn't really competitive, which is backed up by states. I think we sort of need to move very much past that.
Yeah, I'm very much against the kind of what I consider to be kind of unsustainable development model.
Exactly.
Sustainable economic growth is based on positive sum interactions in which people are willing to part with one thing for another, whether it's dollars or any other type of currency or barter, right? That's the nature of economics. And that's going to allow for countries and individuals comparative advantages. Division of labor by comparative advantage leads to more efficiency. And I think that, again, that's not to suggest what we were just talking about isn't a real problem about what would be classified under the tolerable administration of justice, right? You gotta get that right. I think in the work that I've read in political economy, right, it's the first task of government, whether from external or internal threats, is to protect property rights, broadly understood to include people's bodily integrity. Yeah. And once you have that, then you can see the kind of development, because if you have insecure property rights, who's going to want to build something? Who's going to want to build a factory or a restaurant if it could be expropriated by a corrupt official or by a warlord, right? Or a prince somewhere? You have to have that kind of sense to build big investments. And in many ways, the secret of the West is in that property rights revolution. It's not everything, but it's an important thing. And, you think about the Empire State Building or the Chrysler Building in New York. Who would put those types of resources if it could be expropriated easily? Yeah. And I think that's critical. And again, war is a feature. A war involves expropriation in a sense, right? If I remember, seeing places that had been blown up essentially in the conflict over the last, many, many years. And you could just see that it's a shame, right? But whether it's an architectural site like the Bamiyan Buddhas, or sorry, an art site like the Bamiyan Buddhas, or I went to and they've been restored, right? But have both the king's and the queen's palaces been restored?
Aman Allah's palace serves as like the center of the Supreme Court, I believe, if I'm not mistaken.
So I went in when I was in Afghanistan. I had the fortune of being able to walk through before it wasn't even close to being restored at that point. It was basically just a empty shell of a building with artillery holes from, I think, artillery shells hitting it and small arms fire. But you could see the devastation that war brings. So I think that it's getting to that position where you could have peace and a tolerable administration of justice is what we all hope for.
Yeah.
But I think America, going back to where we started, America's withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think, is ultimately, will get us. It's not only good for the United States, but I think it's probably good in the long run for Afghanistan itself.
100%, yeah.
At least that's my working hypothesis. But again, that's not the case upon which I would base my argument for the end of the war in Afghanistan, of our war in Afghanistan.
So you mentioned, this is probably going to be my last question, actually. You mentioned that one of the mistakes was the expansion of the war aims, values promotion and whatever, and that had made sure that instead of the US leaving the war on its terms, that it left it liable to basically being chased away. Would you say now that with everything that went wrong, the US is being chased away?
I think the United States stayed so long, and you saw operational momentum shifts and the balance of power shift, that a reasonable person could conclude that we were retrenching in the face of that. Mm-hmm. I don't think that that's the story that's helpful or tells the whole story, because a big part of this, I think the bigger part of it actually is a recognition here in the United States that this simply was not consistent with our interests. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it was, I don't think that the facts on the ground, as you might say, were the only thing that mattered. Mm-hmm. I would have been happier if we had done this long before. And even if the Trump administration had just said in 2017 when it came in, okay, we're a new administration, we looked at this, costs outweigh the benefits for our interests, and so we're out. And in a way, President Trump signaled that, right? In the 2016 campaign, he talked about talking about getting out of these conflicts. He talked about how Iraq was a debacle. And so I think a reasonable conclusion that maybe it would be great if people internalized in Afghanistan is that the United States wasn't chased out. Don't build don't create a different type of war rug, which instead of the Soviets is Americans, right? It's that we decided enough is enough. It no longer meets our interests, and we left. I think that's a reasonable argument as well.
I would sort of go by. I would sort of draw a parallel, if you'd excuse me, with the American War of Independence, whereby the British still held loyalist bases in places like New York, but the cost of administering what were then the 13 colonies were made so high by the Continental Army that there was no real point in extending sort of the war as it was or as it is now in Afghanistan. Now, the US has funded, and this is the last question, the US has funded hundreds of media outlets in Afghanistan. Indeed, Talor News, the Moby Group, these were instituted with the aid of hundreds of thousands of dollars from US aid. And Dr. Ruger, you've been a prolific advocate on policies pertaining to Afghanistan for years. And now, given how high profile you are as a campaigner in all affairs Afghan, have any other Afghan media outlets invited you to talk to them or to share your views?
I think, unfortunately, not.
I wonder why.
Yeah. No, and again, part of the reason I accepted your kind invitation is that I do like to support the marketplace of ideas, right? It's a big hallmark of the place I work for, the Charles Koch Institute, is to support the marketplace of ideas. And I think that it's important for countries, peoples, it's important for me to hear all kinds of different voices, including the ones I disagree with. And we talked about Nozick, we've talked about other thinkers in the history of political thought, but here I would go to John Stuart Mill, right? It's even if I'm wrong or you're wrong, it's important that these ideas engage with each other. And so thank you for having me on. And look, if Tolo or somebody else wants to have me on, I'll do that as well.
I hope
assuming that it would be, again, I'm not sure that I have as much to offer the Afghan public as you guys do. So I'd like to see maybe you guys ask questions or talk on these outlets, because you know Afghanistan better than I do. And that's kind of maybe the theme of my conversation is that Americans should have humility about our knowledge of Afghanistan and our ability to change things in a direction we think we want. There's the problem of unintended consequences, the problem of the knowledge problem that Hayek talked about writ large. And so we should have humility about that. And so I guess what I would say is to try to suggest some humility. I'll say, like, hey, look, I could be wrong about all these things. Epistemic humility is valuable. And I welcome the debate and engagement and the questions that you guys brought to me.
Believe it or not, though, I'm sure Sangar would concur with me. As true internationalists, I myself feel enriched after our conversation. And so on that note, Dr. Ruga, if anyone wants to contact you, would you prefer that they send you an email or get in contact with you via Twitter?
Yeah, Twitter's a great way, at Will Ruger. I keep my direct messages open so people can contact me. And that's how I think, got in touch maybe the first time. And it's interesting. I have a lot of Afghans who follow me on Twitter. It's always interesting to hear what they have to say. Sometimes I have to use the translate device, though, so I wonder what they are saying.
Sometimes the Google Translate absolutely butchers what you write in Pashto and Dari, but I hope that it doesn't do so in your case. So Dr. Ruger's @ is already to my left.
It's not on the screen. It will be added.
It'll be in the description. And if you want to get involved with a media platform such as ours that invites voices like Dr. Ruger that are conveniently ignored by a lot of other Afghan media establishments, please consider becoming a patron on our Patreon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've got thousands of visits on the website, but the YouTube subscribers haven't caught up yet. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. From me to every one of our listeners, readers, and viewers, Ramadan Mubarak. And Sangar, to you as well, Ramadan Mubarak. Thank you very much for coming on our show, Dr. Ruga. It was a pleasure to have you. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Well, thanks for having me. And whether it's in the US, London, Europe proper, or maybe in even Herat, hopefully we'll have the chance to do this in person and we can talk Locke, Nozick, Hayek, economics, war.
Everything.
Definitely.
As we would say, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.